killings. That has a long history in America.
In our country.
H. Rap Brown said that violence is as American as apple pie. And unfortunately, so is racism. But that doesn't mean because those things are part of a history that we can't overcome them.
Right.
It just means we have to understand it's not going to be easy. I think the words that really characterize the African American experience in this country is overcoming struggle and perseverance. And that's where we are today. We're still in that mode. We're trying to persevere. We will overcome. But we have to understand that what we're going through is part of a process. And freedom isn't free.
No.
There's a price to be paid.
Right. I find it interesting that today we have these, in fact, this past weekend we had these rallies all over the country by students. I'm talking high school students. And then obviously there were adults who filtered into it. But I think a lot of people forget that some of the movements of the past in regards to racism and just standing up for the rights of African American people had also started by students, college students, high school students, and so on, because they're just getting frustrated with.
No, that's right. And I'll just use a couple of quick examples. So that in the Civil Rights Movement, there were the children's marches.
That's right.
Where they were actually, one of the strategies that they used in the South was to fill the jails with children, because people react differently when they see children being bitten, and it took a lot of courage when they saw children being bitten by police dogs, being hosed, when they saw the children being lined up. So Brown versus Board of Education was 5 separate cases that were consolidated, challenging separate but equal in education.
Right.
One of those cases came out of Virginia, and I think it was Farmville, Virginia, but it was the high school students who went out on strike. They were in dilapidated buildings in their Negro school system, and they refused to listen to the principal, to their Board of Education,
right.
And they convinced the NAACP in Richmond to be one of those 5 cases that became Brown versus Board of Education. The other thing is, when you talk about young people, so the people we think of today, Eleanor Holmes Norton,
sure.
Late Marion Barry, mayor for life, they got their start in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, as well as Congressman Lewis. And so at that time, we see them now as older adults,
sure.
part of the system, but they were firebrands. They were young, they were full of enthusiasm,
sure.
And it was SNCC in particular who forced the older people in the SCLC sometimes to take actions that they may not have taken. But that was the importance of the youth. The youth had the energy and the drive to actually go out there and to say, we are tired and we're not going to take it anymore. And one of the things I think that's important is that with SNCC, they had Ella Baker, who was working with SCLC, who was older, as their advisor. So what you had is, you had the passion and the fire and the energy of the youth with some of the advice from an older person who also had some life experiences, so that they could work together, the two of them. And SNCC, as well as SCLC and Martin Luther King, really produced some of the changes that we benefit from today. And the other thing I just want to say is, African American history is American history.
Definitely.
Without African American history, you wouldn't have American history.
Absolutely.
I think it's not something that you just restrict to 1 month a year. I celebrate it, I learn, I embrace it, I talk about it 12 months a year. And then any issue in American society that you want to talk about, labor, the struggle for religious freedom, the struggle for the First Amendment, association, freedom of the press, all of those are contained within the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality that African Americans have fought for. So that the women's movement, the Chicano movement, the gay pride movement, all of those took their cues from the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. So whether it's music,
right.
a lot of people don't know, and I asked during the session at work, I said, and Rolling Stones was one of the premier rock groups of the 60s. I said, can somebody tell me where they got their name from? And people didn't know. They got it from a Muddy Waters tune, like a Rolling Stone. So roll. Oh, there he is right there, Muddy Waters. So that they got their inspiration. The Beatles took their name from Buddy Holly and the Crickets, who were inspired by people like Little Richard, as well as Jerry Lee Lewis. And so without R&B, soul music, and the blues, you wouldn't have had rock and roll. And without rock and roll, you wouldn't have had rock. It's just whatever. And again, the perseverance, the struggle. People don't realize there was a time when blacks were not allowed, it's hard to believe, in the National Basketball Association.
Sure. Right.
Yeah. People know that Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball in 1947. But for professional basketball, it was after that. Now imagine an NBA that is now, I think, about 75% black with no black players. With no black players. Think of the Washington Redskins with no black players. They were, I believe, the last of National Football League teams to integrate, and they did not do it voluntarily. They did it because RFK Stadium was on federal property, and in order to get the lease renewed, the Secretary of the Interior, who controlled their property, told them they had to integrate the team. And that is one reason why you see a lot of Dallas fans in Washington, because of the Redskins' treatment and attitude toward black athletes at that time.
I think you just challenged me to change my football team.
That's right.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's we're about halfway through the show. I'm asking you all to please call in. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, you'd just like to join the conversation, you can do that at 240-719-2560. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in roughly 2 minutes. Thank you all, and see you shortly.
Am I doing too much? Because that's where it's going. I'm getting all wrong.
No, you're killing it.
See, you know, hey man, see, that's what gets me going. When people like you, man, then that's what I get fired up. So you see, we go on.
You ain't talking about George Preston Marshall yet.
Yeah, that's right.
He's still up there, right in front.
Yeah. And you know you in his house because he don't never amen and hallelujah over there.
Yes, but see, that's what
But that's how it works.
Because when I get that, that's what gets me going. I feed off of.
Oh yeah, you're right though.
I feed off. Yeah, when you hear people, you know.
Yeah, it was some good stuff.
A lot of people don't know what the story about that man. You gotta look that man right there. That's my favorite.
The Rolling Stones. This song is like a Rolling Stone. And what's his name? Mick Jagger would be the first one to tell you. Mick Jagger, they would say the black blues musician. And then Jimi Hendrix, I saw something in the post that Jimmy was such a trendsetter. If you look at Little Richard, Jimmy looks a lot like that with a slide. They're saying a Prince. See his influence on him. When Jimmy came to Washington in '68 for concert, the way he dressed, these shoes were southern. They were arresting him in Georgetown just for being dressed. Yeah. The way he was walking across the street as a white guy, and I guess they were so, yeah, he was up, so just, what? They just arrested him just because of the way he dressed. Yeah.
That's a good information.
Purple haze, man.
Good stuff. That's how word works. Yeah, that we can tell all of this.
The light bulb, in terms of the bulb and silicon, everything gets compressed. But I mean, like shoes, the mastered up. I mean, and that's what this is without us. Or Washington, D.C. The architect for Washington got the funding for the Washington. Took this plan and went home, teared up on. He's never dressed up right. That's something else. Land. Reproduce those plans for memory.
That's why I got a Redskin man today.
I think I might be
Maryland was the last of the ACC to integrate too. New Maryland.
All right, welcome back. I have just been beat up on, and I've been given an application for a Dallas Cowboy fan club. I'm refusing the Cowboys because I've built a disdain. I've built a disdain against them for all of these years. So we're going to consider maybe the Philadelphia Eagles. I don't know. But anyway, welcome back, everyone. You have tuned into In the End We Win with Kurtis. I've got my guest, my friend to the show, Clarence Featherson, and we are knee deep in a conversation that's challenging even the history books that we grew up on. You are encouraged to call in. You can do so at 240-719-2560. I encourage you to call if you have any questions or if you just want to just chime in on the conversation. We encourage you to do that. We're going to continue the conversation. So you mentioned President Obama, and I have a question. What do you think about if he was to have become, or we had let's use that, if he himself had become president in a different era, maybe the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s, do you think he would have been more impactful?
I don't think he could have been president in a different era.
Okay, but if all of the stars and the moons and the suns aligned...
See, here's the thing. I don't think they could have aligned, and this is why I'm such a proponent of history. You have to understand how one thing leads to another. So let's look at America, for instance. After World War II, you started to see little bits of finally progress from the federal government towards taking a position on civil rights, on integration. So what you had is in 1947, I believe it was, Truman issued an executive order that said we will have integration in the armed forces. Now, he didn't give a specific date. He just said that the forces would decide how soon and to what extent it was possible. In World War II, as the United States was fighting Nazi Germany with its ideas of racism and white supremacy, the black soldiers who were fighting in Germany were also dealing with some of the same issues that Germany was trying to propagate in Europe, right here in America.
Okay.
So that the Tuskegee Airmen, people may know of now, they didn't know at the time, was an attempt by the United States to give black men finally a chance to prove their manhood and fight. Now, after World War II, there was the Cold War. So we are now, the United States, in competition with Russia for the heart and soul of the world. Particularly if you look at the mineral resources that are available in Africa, they were then, they still are today, that are needed for producing a lot of the things that we use in our society, for the oil in the Middle East, for a lot of the products that were in India. So those nations were called the Afro-Asian nations. The United States would say, we are your friend. We want to show you democracy. Russia would point to the lynchings of servicemen who came home in uniform and were dragged off the bus and were killed or beaten, and they would broadcast it in newspapers. They would say to the world, how can they be the defenders of democracy when they treat their own people so badly that in the nation's capital, the stores, the schools are segregated. The Russians would say, we don't practice that. Well, they had their form of segregation, but it was not written into law the way it was in the South. So in the South, in the constitutional codes of states, you had separate but equal, not equal actually, you just had the separation was mandated by law. It makes it very hard to tell the world that you're a proponent of democracy, that you want to help them when you haven't begun to help your people at home. Right. And so the steps that the United States took, when after the Brown versus Board of Education was decided, the federal troops having to help the students get into Little Rock High School in Arkansas, all those were forced in some ways upon the president. Eisenhower reluctantly did that. The confrontations with the integration of the University of Alabama by Vivian Malone, and I can't think of the male student, she graduated. The black male, 2 students, they're depicted in the scene of Forrest Gump when the troops are there and they're having to get into class, and also people might have seen the clips where George Wallace is blocking the door when they're trying to get in, and he's saying segregation today, segregation forever. And they had worked something out with the Kennedy administration where he would do that, they would bring federal troops, there would be a backing down, but the point is, to the world was watching. Right. So that the steps that were taken, the small steps then were necessary to begin to show the world why they should trust the United States. But that didn't mean that America itself, that the voters had changed. In 1968, a lot of people don't know this, George Wallace, who was running as a Democrat, but on a states' rights platform, won the Democratic primary in Maryland.
Oh, wow.
That's right. That was 68. So I don't see if George Wallace and then Richard Nixon won on the law and order platform, which basically meant get the hippies, the Black Panthers, the SNCC people, and all those civil rights protesters and the anti-war people and the SDS students, get them off the streets, get them out of town, get them wherever, but just get them away from here. And we want law and order. And so I don't think that the time would have been right. Shirley Chisholm ran for president in 72, and she could not get much support even among black elected officials, because the first thing politicians always want to do is they want to get reelected. That's the reality. They're not religious leaders. Politicians want to get reelected. They tend to want to go with the winners, and they did not see her as being a viable candidate. Then let's look at Jesse Jackson. So Jesse Jackson articulated a lot of good ideas. He was a progressive politician, but you also have to look at his style. So Jesse was very forceful, he was outspoken, and Jesse, a lot of people remembered him when he had the dashikis, when he had the afros. And that scared a lot of your white voting electorate. Now let's compare that to Barack Obama. Barack Obama grew up in Hawaii. So his style is not really confrontational. His style is very, it's a calming, he's a diplomatic person. And so I think, though, what had happened is that Jesse's, even though he was not successful in his bid for the presidency, because he did win 20% of the Democratic primary the second time he ran for office, it showed that there could be a viable black presidential candidate, but things happened step by step. And so that I think had Barack run in the 60s, it wouldn't have happened. Now, I'll just give you a perfect example. Everyone knows about Martin Luther King, and I wouldn't say everyone, but a lot of people, the Montgomery bus boycott. He was chosen to lead the boycott by the other church leaders in the city because the feeling was that whoever led the boycott, if he pulled it off, would become one of the most important religious leaders, and they were afraid of who would get that power and prestige. And here's the new kid in town. Well, the church that Martin Luther King was now pastor of, he had replaced a man named Vernon Jordan.
Yes.
Vernon Johns, that most people aren't aware of. He tried to do a lot of the same things that Martin Luther King has become known for. Boycotts, confronting police brutality, a number of things, but the times were not right for him. And ultimately the board removed him, and they brought in who they thought was going to be a less confrontational, a more middle-class, steadfast Negro preacher, third-generation Negro preacher, and someone who would maintain the status quo. The congregation was basically middle-class. They didn't want someone to ruffle people's feathers.
Sure.
After World War II, you had black veterans coming back. People who had fought overseas and fought for the rights of the United States were less likely to want to be pushed around here. And so the country, people, they have to be prepared for change. It doesn't happen overnight. And this gets back to the theme you were talking about. Are we ever going to reach a point in time when we have equality? I think yes, we will, but it's going to be a long time coming. But if we understand that, and then if we look at what we've survived, the Middle Passage, being captured, our ancestors in Africa, being put on ships, being beaten, being whooped, being sold, even after freedom, second-class citizenship, fighting, perseverance, struggle. That's what we've done for the whole time we've been here. And so I don't really see why anything all of a sudden is going to change. I just think maybe the styles and the methods are going to change. But it is about struggle. That's what our story is, struggle, perseverance. In the end, we will win. But I think sometimes people look at things and think it's going to happen faster than it does. You look at one of the most successful ethnic groups in this country, and they're ethnic and racial, which are Jewish Americans. So Jewish people have been dealing with anti-Semitism for 5,000 years. So even though they've accomplished a lot, a lot of professionals. They're very successful. You still see the swastikas, and one thing the Klan always does is they don't just say get rid of the Negroes. They lump the Jews and the Negroes and the foreigners and everybody. So they're still dealing with it after 5,000 years. It's in some ways the oldest hatred. The color prejudice we're experiencing today is within the past 600 years. The Romans, the Greeks, they looked at African people, particularly the Egyptians, as the standard bearers of high civilization. Most of the slaves in the Roman Empire were white, and they came from an area, what is we think of now as Romania, and they were Slavic peoples, which is where the word slave comes from. It wasn't about color then. And so if Jewish people have been dealing with it for this period of time, they've made progress, they're successful, but they're still dealing with prejudice and discrimination. Maybe not on the same level or the same type we are, but it's just something that we have to be aware of. It's going to take time. But knowing that, I think it just makes us more committed to keep the struggle going.
Sure. So all that being said, and very, very informational. You sound very adept at the knowledge and the history. Marching and marches, are they effective in 2018?
I think they are, because again, the politicians look at these young people. Some of them are going to be old enough to vote. The young people are influencing their parents. And I don't think the politicians can tell which of those people won't be able to vote. And again, the first thing a politician wants to do is to get re-elected.
Right.
And as we were talking before this session, you mentioned that some of the young people's motives are being attacked.
That's right.
Again, this is where history comes in. There were actually people who said that Martin Luther King, that the civil rights protesters, that the children were communist-led. That essentially it was because of outside agitators that people didn't want to ride in the back of the bus, that they didn't want to go to inferior schools, that they didn't want inferior housing, that left alone America did not have a Negro problem. That our folks are happy and we treat them like family. We call them auntie and uncle. But it's some agitators, it's the communists, it's the people who hate America, who want to stir up the Negroes and make them demand equality. I think it's the same thing with these young people who are marching. One of the things I'm so proud of them, is that some of them made the connection and they spoke and they said, even the white students, we are speaking on behalf of the black women who have been killed and no one pays attention to them. I think it gets back to how much are we valued in American society, and one of the reasons I tell folks to study the history, to know your history, is because even if America does not value us the way we should, we need to value ourselves. It is very hard being black in America, and knowing your history is a part of therapy. It helps you to stay sane in a society that, if you're not careful, can make you go crazy.
Did you hear that 11-year-old girl, sister, I think young lady, she was from Virginia.
That's right.
She gave that powerful speech, and addressed just that, referencing the black women who had been murdered, and she called them by name, and she spoke so eloquently. I'm going to see if I can pull that up and maybe run a clip of it before we end tonight. But
and your lines are open for calls, right?
Yes. 240-719-2560. Absolutely. Please call in. So I don't know if I heard the actual answer. So then, is Black History Month still, is it necessary? Is it effective? I know there's multiple questions there, but
I think the answer is yes. So I'll start off by saying, one, we are not in a post-racial America. I never want to live in a post-racial America. I think of America as a collage made up of different people, different colors, and each of them has a story. Each of them adds a flavor and a spice to America. But what I want us to do is move beyond where being black is something negative. That black is something that is being celebrated, that our lives are valued, that we are seen and recognized for the contributions we've made to America, that we're not receiving it, we haven't received it. But the way it works is that if you want people to really know your story, you have to tell it. You can't leave your story to be told by other people.
Sure.
And so the first thing we have to do is to know it ourselves. And then when we know our value, when we know our worth, when we know our contributions, even if the larger society tries to tell us that we are not valuable, that we are not worthy of saving or protecting or treating equally, then we know that's not true. So that we do not internalize negative values. So when you feel good about yourself, when you know who you are, where you know where you're from, it also helps you to have an idea of where you're going. And in the end, that's how you win. It gives you a vision of where you want to go based upon where you've been.
Wonderful. Wow. And so your work, is it in that area? Is it in the area of African American history or?
African American history, working with groups, supporting groups, and if I could, I'd like to just put a plug in very quickly for a friend of mine, Abdul Rahman Muhammad. He's doing the Malcolm X Historical Excursion bus. It's a coach bus tour, and it's going to be held on May the 19th. For more information, people can call or text 202-276-1333, 202-276-1333. It's the Malcolm X Historical Excursion or Coach Bus Tour. This gentleman, I've worked with him for decades, and he